What's poppin', everybody? My name is G and you're watching Keeping This Tech. Today's video, a dope video. We have the A7R Mark V here. As you guys know, it was recently released. It's been about 2 months. We also have the A7 IV here as well. And we're gonna go ahead and do a comparison between these two. Now, at first I thought it was a bit silly to do a comparison between the A7 IV and the R5 because, well, they're two different categories of cameras, but honestly, if you're thinking about upgrading from the A7 IV to the A7R Mark V, you might find this video helpful. Or if you don't have either one of these yet, and you're thinking about upgrading or purchasing one of them, maybe this video will also help. Now, again, the A7 IV is a beast in its own right. It's a powerhouse of a camera, and the A7R Mark V is the same. I just feel like it all depends on what you're doing and what would work best for you given your particular situation. That being said, let's go ahead and get into the video. All right, guys, so today's Tuesday. We're talking cameras. We have the A7R Mark V and the A7 IV right here. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about really the differences between these cameras and honestly, quite shockingly, the similarities. There's a lot that these cameras have in common. I would say these cameras are about 80% of the same, given the fact that they're actually two different sensor types. But for the most part, you're gonna get pretty much the same performance out of these cameras. But let's go ahead and go over some of the details real quick. In terms of handling and ergonomics, there's only just a little bit that's different between the A7 IV and the A7R5. This pretty much looks and feels like an A7 IV. The multi-hot shoe, interface shoe, still the same. It receives Sony microphones, flashes, camera lights, whatever else they got going on for that multi-interface hot shoe. You have a mode dial and a sub mode dial now on the A7R Mark V, and that's directly pulled from the A7 IV. The only difference is now there's a release button, which I find to be very strange, only because honestly, I've had the A7 IV since launch, and I've never had a situation where I would accidentally switch into aperture priority from manual or vice versa. In fact, it's actually pretty stiff when you're moving the modes around. And so I feel like it's pretty secure and I don't have to worry about it. But this release button here, when you're using a camera with a cage, it's super annoying to get that button to go down and to make changes quickly on the fly. So, I mean, if I had my choice and what type of button it would be, I'd have it be a lock button, just like what it's found on the exposure compensation dial, which is unlabeled now and unmarked, just like on the A7 IV. The back, as far as buttons go and layout, is exactly the same. The screen and the EVF are where we start to differ in terms of design. Now, I'll say this, the EVF on the A7 IV is absolutely an upgrade from the A7 III. That being said, the A7R5's EVF just blows it out of the water. So you're talking about 9+ million dots here on this EVF, and it's like true to life, color accuracy, brightness. It's just a beautiful display in here. And on top of that, when you're shooting with 61 megapixels, this is the type of EVF that you want on a camera like this. It's on the A7S III, it's on the A1, and now it's finally at home where it really belongs, on the R line. And it makes the EVF on the A7 IV seem bad, even though it really isn't. It's decent, and it's just not as, good as this. Now, the displays are interesting. Obviously, you might have heard about this new version of their display where you can flip it out, right? And you can tilt it, which is absolutely incredible. And for photos, and now that this camera is a formidable video camera as well, this absolutely makes sense. What I think is also interesting, and I think what I like the most about this display, is that it's actually bigger. The footprint of the display is more like a 3:2 aspect ratio. So if you're looking at photos, it really fills up the entire display. And when you're talking about video, none of that clutter of information is filling up the frame. It's actually on the black bars at the top, which is really, really nice, versus what's found on the A7 IV, which is still nice, but it's a 16:9. Again, the display, the EVF, honestly make the experience on the A7R Mark V slightly better. In terms of I/O, you pretty much have the same I/O. You have the same microphone, headphone jack, USB-C, USB micro on here as well for those legacy devices. In terms of the USB-C, it does support power delivery for both cameras, and it also sends video signals so you can use these cameras as webcams. I mean, you're gonna be looking fresher than anybody else on your Zoom calls for sure. Now, a place where these two cameras do differ, and again, by a significant margin, in my opinion, is the HDMI. On the A7 IV, you're just getting a basic HDMI. It's gonna put out signal, and that's just really good for you to monitor, nothing crazy. On the A7R Mark V, though, you're gonna get an HDMI that's more enhanced. In fact, you can, film RAW or 16-bit into an Atomos Ninja. It's just better. It's actually the same HDMI port that's found on the A7S III, the FX3. You do have a flash sync port for those studio photographers that do that. In terms of the card slots and media, you have dual card slots for UHS 2 and CF Express Type A cards on the A7R5, and you only have one CF Express Type A port for the A7 IV. Now, I will say it's more meaningful to actually use a CF Express Type A card with the A7R Mark V, because when you're bursting 61 megapixels and writing and buffering, all that stuff is way better, and it's again a better experience on the A7R Mark V with those new card types. So that is that. Now, in terms of battery life, I guess I should mention this. They're the same. I haven't noticed that one camera is depleting battery over the other. It all depends on which modes that you're in and what type of shooting you're doing, but tit for tat, they're about the same in terms of the way they run. Let's go ahead and talk about the internals. Now, I should say this before starting. Both of these cameras have the same brain, if you will. They're using the same chip, the Beyonce XR chip. So really all of the capabilities of the A7 IV are actually found in the A7R Mark V. So you're not missing out if you're in the camp of not having either one of these and you skip the A7 IV and just go for the A7R Mark V. You're gonna basically get everything that's in here in the A7R Mark V. Actually, in reverse, the same is not true. There are absolutely features on the A7R Mark V that you'll never get on the A7 IV. So that's just the way that would work. All right, so let's jump into the sensors, and that's really honestly where I think we should begin, because the sensors will either unlock or limit certain capabilities. Now, Sony on both cameras gave us different file types and sizes that you can choose from. You have uncompressed, which is all of the information, but a huge file size, at their respective native resolutions. You also have lossless compressed, which is a truncated size, but you're still getting a lot of the information, if not all of it. Now, you have different file sizes that you can choose from. On the A7R Mark V is 61 for the large, 26 for the medium, and 15 for the small, versus 33 for the large, 15 for the medium, and 8 for the small. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I don't see a world where I'd be shooting at either 15 or 8 megapixels. That doesn't make sense to me, only maybe if I was running out of storage or something like that. But again, that goes to show you that really with 61 megapixels, there's so much data and so much megapixels that you can kind of throw away if you don't need them. You're gonna still have a super high resolution image at 26 megapixels. Now, the good news is both cameras are actually downsampling from that larger resolution to that medium or that small. So you are getting the benefits of getting a crisper image. And in the A7R's case, you're actually getting a low light advantage as well. That might be the trade-off for the next thing that I'm about to mention. Basically, you can't get 10 frames a second at any of those options unless you're shooting compressed RAW. Now, compressed RAW is going to take your file size from a 14-bit to a 12-bit, so you're losing a little bit of data there. Honestly, not really noticeable data unless you're like shooting way underexposure or way overexposure. So compressed RAW for both of these cameras is perfectly fine. If you need to burst, I would have no hesitation shooting compressed RAW. Now, both of these cameras have what's called APS-C mode, which is you can crop in and you can take those photos, and you still get the same respective medium sizes when you're cropping in or in APS-C mode for photos. Again, more useful on the A7R than on the A7 IV. Okay, so I know that I mentioned the same feature set that's found on the A7 IV is more or less integrated in the A7R Mark V. And so things like breathing compensation, the variable shutter, being able to turn on eye detection and turn it off while you're filming in video, that's all there. There are, again, some things that are specific to the A7R Mark V that we gotta go over. Number one, focus stacking. That's brand new. It happens in camera. There's that pixel shift mode, which to me is more of a gimmick than anything else, but it has been proved over the A7R Mark IV if you're into that. The autofocus is different. There's now a dedicated chip on the A7R Mark V to detect human poses and animals and insects and cars and birds and planes. I do want to actually pause right here and make a really important point. On the A7 IV, there is nothing wrong with the A7 IV's autofocus. This camera can autofocus like you would not believe. And it is incredible what Sony has done with this camera. If you're a portrait photographer and you've been shooting with the A7 IV, or you plan on shooting with the A7 IV, you're gonna nail most of the shots most of the time because this autofocus is just amazing. If you take another camera like the A7R Mark V, same model, same photographer, you're gonna get the same results. It's not gonna really be that different. It's when you start talking about tracking people and different things in the foreground and you're being like super creative with it or maybe abstract, that's when you start to see the benefits of the A7R Mark V's autofocus, right? When you start talking about planes and trains and insects, that's when it starts to get interesting versus the A7 IV. So by no means is the A7 IV's autofocus not good. It's actually excellent. It's just that the A7R Mark V has to overdo it because it's also autofocusing at 61 megapixels. And in many ways, without this autofocus on this A7R Mark V, it wouldn't be able to keep up with the performance that you're getting with the A7 IV. I've said enough. I'm gonna move on. Okay. So one of the last few things I'll talk about in terms of stills, and this is gonna lead us right into the video performance, is the ISO on both of these cameras, right? The elephant in the room is the A7R Mark V good in low light? And the answer is the A7 IV is a beast in low light. And when it comes to the low light performance, it's incredible. I actually did a video about this with the sensor and how it performs in low light. It's really remarkable. I mean, from 400 to 2500, you really can't tell a difference. It's not adding any extra grain or any noise to your image when you're bumping up the sensitivity of the ISO on the A7 IV. You're not gonna get that same performance on the A7R Mark V. That being said, having owned the A7R Mark IV, I can tell you that this is way better in low light than that camera is, and it's just the nature of the game, right? You have 61 megapixels. The pixels in there are dense. It's not getting as much light like an A7S III or even the A7 IV. So is the A7 IV better in low light for photos? Yeah, but is the A7R Mark V bad? Hell no. It's actually pretty good, very good, for the fact that it's actually pushing 61 megapixels. And that's the thing here. It's one of these things that you have to see, but I would have no problem using this in a wedding situation or in an indoor event and in an evening event, if you will. And also remember too, if 61 megapixels isn't a priority, when you downsample this to 26 megapixels for that lossless compression, you're actually getting a cleaner file than you would get at 61 megapixels. So you're able to get your cake and eat it too with the A7R Mark V. So if it was only a low light test, obviously it goes to the A7 IV. But the sum of all the parts, you can't go wrong with the A7R Mark V in terms of low light, just because there's no other camera that's delivering this performance at really high megapixels for ISO. That's just what it is. All right, now the other thing I'll say too is that we gotta talk about IBIS, right? IBIS on the A7R Mark V, there's 8 stops of IBIS on here, and it's noticeable versus the 5 stops on the A7 IV. In terms of photography, I can definitely get my shutter speed down to 1/4, 1/5, and still get the shot. It's insane. And whereas with the A7 IV, we're looking at 1/10 or 1/8 of a second. So you're able to really stop down with the shutter and knock it out of the park, and so get the benefit of being able to shoot in low light. So let's go ahead and talk about video, because this is where it also gets a little bit more interesting. In terms of the A7R Mark V, I gotta be honest with you guys, this camera surprised the hell out of me. I've had the A7R IV, like I mentioned before, and I kind of just got used to the fact that it was not a video camera, and it would be like a third or even fourth rate experience when filming video on that camera. But this right here is definitely changed that on the A7R Mark V. That being said, let's go ahead and talk about the A7 IV first, and then we'll do the A7R5 in just a bit. In terms of the A7 IV, you're going to have 4K 30 frames, full frame, oversampled from 7K to 4K. So really sharp image. This camera can shoot 4K 60, but at the expense of an APS-C crop. Now, honestly, I know some people love it, some people don't care, some people hate it. I'm in the camp of don't care and hate it, only because I'm also a real estate videographer and shooting wide is what I do. And it's just a problem to have to always switch lenses or use, an APS-C lens instead of using a full frame lens, since this is actually a full frame camera. And when it's in APS-C mode, if you just want to shoot in APS-C mode, you have a 6K downsample. So either way, this camera is downsampling and giving you an extra crispy image that you could, go to town with. You have all the codecs in here: S-Log3, S-Log2, S-Cinetone, HLG, you name it, it lives in here. And it also lives in here as well on the A7R Mark V. Now, on the A7R Mark V, it's capable of filming up to 8K in 24 frames a second. Now, I will say this about the 8K. To me, it's more of a gimmick, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But you can also shoot 4K 60 on here. And the difference between the 4K 60 and even the 8K is that it's cropping in on the sensor at 1.2 times, which is different than on the A7 IV. On the A7 IV, it's 1.5. And you would think that, oh, it's only a 0.3 difference. It can't be that different, but it actually is. A 14mm lens on an A7 IV is more like a 20mm lens if you're shooting in 4K 60, versus on here, it's more like a 16mm lens. So it's still ultra wide, and I'm losing 2mm instead of losing 7, which again, if you're shooting real estate, you know that that's a big difference, and it can make or break the type of shot that you're trying to capture. So 4K 60, I feel like, goes to this camera. I should say that this is an 8K sensor, but there's no downsampling from 8K in the regular 4K 30 or 24 frame modes, or even 4K 60. It's a pixel bin mode, which means it's line skipping. That being said, is the image bad? No. Can I tell the difference? No, I believe Gerald Undone said it's the same that he's seen on the A1. That's Sony's flagship camera. And even if he didn't say that, to me, I would have no problem with this. Just because somebody's saying it's pixel bin doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that the technology that they're using to get you the image is different from oversampling. So there's that. Take that for what you will. Now, you do get oversampled 4K if you are in crop mode, which is a 1.5 crop, and you are at 6K downsampling to 4K, so it'll be extra crispy when you're shooting in that way. Now, both of these cameras actually have a slow reading sensor. They're not stacked, so you're gonna get, rolling shutter on both of these, depending on how you shoot, if you're moving your camera around. Now, back to the 8K. Why is 8K a gimmick? Well, you have to film really only in 24 frames a second. You can't have your subject moving fast, and you can't be panning your camera. It pretty much has to be on a tripod. Plus, 8K gobbles up data. So to me, it's just like there was a whole bunch of people in the room. The head guy was like, I don't want to put 8K. And everybody else was like, dude, you have to. You have to. He's like, fine. Give him the worst 8K possible. And they did. Now, it's not worse in terms of quality. The quality of the image is okay. It's just the way they've implemented it and how you can use it. It's very limiting. So to me, again, it goes up there with pixel shift. I'll never use that feature. So that's fine. But yeah, don't get this camera for 8K, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of video for both of these cameras is overheating. So let's start with the A7 IV. The A7 IV will overheat. And yes, I have the auto temperature set to high. I have the screen taken away from the back of the camera. I've done everything the right way. In room temperature, the camera will overheat if it's been running for an hour and 20 minutes. Now, there's a couple of things that I'll say about that, and you guys can make with it what you will. Maybe it's overheating because it's downsampling regardless of what mode it's in. Maybe it takes a lot from the camera. I have no idea. But again, room temperature and it's overheating. I will say this, when it does shut off because it overheats, I can turn the camera back on and it'll run again for at least another 50 minutes before it shuts down for overheating. So it's not a situation where it overheats and I can't use it. but it's just something to know. If you're trying to put this camera in a place where you may be capturing a ceremony or you need to record for an hour for whatever reason, there's a good chance that within that hour, it's gonna overheat on you. And that's just kind of the nature of the game. And again, not in direct sunlight, overheats. And it's happened multiple times. In terms of the A7R Mark V though, this is interesting because the camera does not overheat. It doesn't overheat in 4K 60. Actually, it does overheat in 8K. And I would say I got about an hour worth of filming in 8K before it overheated, which honestly is pretty impressive. The one thing that I'll mention about this camera, if you're gonna get it, is that, you know, typically we're told to remove the screen from the display, but this camera has obviously another attachment to the back of the screen. So you need to actually pull everything away from the screen if you're gonna film, and that'll really help with the overheating. When I did that, I got over an hour worth of 8K. In fact, my memory card filled up before it overheated. So in that regard, the A7R Mark V is better in terms of overheating because it hasn't overheated on me, and I did put it through its paces. So that's good. Now, I don't know if it has anything to do with the design of the camera, but yeah, the overheating is almost non-existent on this camera unless you're filming in 8K. All right, so let's go ahead and sum everything up here because, you know, we've talked a lot about all the differences and some of the similarities. And so this is kind of like my final thoughts when I think about these two cameras. First of all, they're both great. They're fantastic. They're amazing hybrid cameras. And to be honest with you, the A7R Mark V really shocked me with how good it was in video. I mean, it pretty much has A7S III specs on an A7R camera. I mean, and just saying that is just like, whoa, that's wild. Now, here's the thing though. You got to think about really what the priority is. What are you delivering and who are you delivering it to and how will it be seen? If you're only delivering for web, Instagram, social, you know, then 61 megapixels is going to be overkill. Do you really need that? Is your priority low light? Because if it is low light, then it's going to have to go to the A7 IV, hands down. The A7 IV is just going to be better at low light. But on the other side of that, if your priority is high resolution, it's going to have to be the A7R Mark V. So, you know, you kind of have to pick and choose. Now, both of these ultimates, if you will, have their own solutions, right? With software and doing stuff in post. You can reduce noise in post and you can enhance resolution in post as well. So it's not really a big deal. So it all depends on what works best for you. Hopefully this helps. I know it's a lot of information. If you made it to this video so far, I want to thank you for watching. Consider subscribing. I'll check you guys out next week. We talk cameras on Tuesdays, so I'll see you then. Peace.